He sticks his head out there, getting used to taking hits with this bone, not these other bones, straight into his face. Because, you see, you use it as a weapon, and when you twist your body, it makes the strike more powerful. Now, here's the tricky bit. We're talking about 36 bones in there, but he's only got 2 solid ones to work with. Don't mess with his teeth, just keep your touch right, alright? Because when you get it right, it can really knock someone out. You follow? But remember, we don't want to end up in court, so it's gotta be done properly.
Because you use it as a weapon, and you rotate your body so that it's effective. Now, this is the hardest part. These are what, about fucking 36?
You might know these 2 lads I'm talking about, Gary and Terry O'Neill. Yeah, they're good mates of mine. So, G, I'm pretty sure he's like a total TR, you know? G Spiers was a beast, like a real powerhouse. He was into Goju-G style and used to carry around these aluminium nunchucks covered in blue leather. This guy was massive, must have been around 6'5" and at least 17.5 stone of pure muscle. You've seen all the Bruce Lee stuff, where they're flipping around? Well, G was like that, but just chilling with the nunchucks under his arm. Then, wham! He'd swing it and knock some poor guy out cold. No cuts, just lights out. Now, if you want to get clever, give yourself some space. And if it gets really serious, you can bring both legs into play. If you like, you can just let it go. Snap, break the guy's legs, whatever you need. Want to really mess with him? Keep your thumb there and just keep hitting until he can't take it. You with me?
Give yourself a bit of room, so if it's necessary, you can do both legs in. Now you can let this go if you like, right? You can have his snout, his eyes, his larynx.
Yeah, it's true. I make my living by fighting. And it's also true that most of my opponents end up in the hospital because I'm pretty damn good at it. These words come from Gary Spiers, a guy whose name once sent chills down the spine, but earned huge respect in the martial arts world. His fame stretched beyond the streets of Liverpool, known for his unbeatable skill in both karate and street fighting. Spiers wasn't just a martial artist, he was a machine, pure and simple. His no-nonsense approach to defending himself made him one of the toughest, most skilled fighters of his time. Let's dive into the life of the fighter they used to call the Animal. Gary Spiers was born in 1943 in New Zealand with a bit of Maori heritage. His dad was an American soldier he never knew, and his mum was from the Maori culture. Growing up, Gary was strongly influenced by Maori traditions and their warrior spirit. It helped shape the way he approached martial arts. One of his first memories of combat? A pinup from Ring magazine, a true fighter's inspiration. The image showed Rocky Marciano's fist splitting Jersey Joe Walcott's nose right down the middle with a punch. At just 7 years old, Gary was itching to start boxing, but his mum wasn't having any of it. So he took up wrestling instead and quickly got hooked on it. Back in the early 1950s, New Zealand was full of immigrants from all over Europe, each bringing their own beliefs, cultures, and prejudices. These attitudes got passed down to their kids, and Gary's school, with around 1,000 students, had about 40% immigrants. Gary, proud of his Maori heritage, was one of just 7 students with Maori roots. As the minority group, they faced a lot of harassment, and Gary often found himself in fights at school. When Gary's mum passed away, he was still a teenager and ended up in an orphanage. Being of mixed race, he immediately became a target for bullying. On his first night there, someone tried to assault him. That was the moment Gary knew he needed to learn how to fight. He eventually left the orphanage and was taken in by an aunt. While working as a butcher, he became fascinated with karate after reading E.J. Harrison's Manual of Karate. But before diving into karate, he gave judo a shot. Thanks to his wrestling background, he picked it up fast and appreciated how practical it was, especially learning moves like choking someone out with their own jacket, stuff that could come in handy outside the gym. In 1962, at about 19, Gary moved to Australia for work and started serious karate training in Brisbane. He joined a dojo run by John Ryan, practicing the Okinawan Shorei style. While it didn't have the hand speed of boxing or the roughness of wrestling, he liked the kicks and the fact that it taught you how to take on multiple opponents. But as karate became more popular and schools popped up everywhere, Gary grew unimpressed with a lot of the instructors. He often traveled for work, paying for yearly memberships just to get a few lessons before moving on. And he'd think that most of these teachers wouldn't stand a chance against him in a real fight. Around 1963, Gary started working as a doorman at various bars and clubs in Melbourne. Standing about 6 feet tall and weighing 240 pounds, he was built for the job. With his wrestling and judo skills, he was perfect for keeping the peace. But Gary didn't like the term bouncer. He preferred calling himself a professional security advisor, or saying he worked in the attitude adjustment industry. Bouncers are just brash ladies out jogging, aren't they? He'd say in his thick Kiwi accent. Then, in 1964, when Gary was 21, he had his first real taste of street violence. He was stabbed in the face by a group of Italians. It all started over a misunderstanding of a word, and by the end of the fight, 12 of them had been slashed, including one of Gary's friends who got stabbed 22 times and ended up on a kidney machine. The trouble started because the Maori word for mate translates to homosexual in Corsican, which sparked the conflict. The Italians ambushed them in a car park, and Gary, being the biggest in the group, was the first to be attacked while carrying a case of beer. They slashed him from under his right eye, down his nose, slicing through one nostril, his lips, and all the way to his jaw. Even though the knife was small, the damage was serious. But despite being stabbed, Gary didn't go down. Gary's face was practically sliced in half, and as he breathed out, blood sprayed out in a mist through the hole in his nose, blinding him. But even though things were a blur, he didn't back down. Witnesses said he locked the attacker's arm to stop another stab, threw him down, and smashed his spine. The guy crawled under a parked car, probably saving his life. Gary had damaged 13 of his vertebrae, and 9 months later, the attacker showed up in court, still in a wheelchair, which Gary found pretty satisfying. Gary always believed that his regular training in karate and wrestling, about 4 to 5 days a week, is what saved his life. As a reminder of that fight, he'd proudly show off an 8-inch scar running down his face. Like, the guy wasn't already scary enough, right? In 1968, Gary had another serious run-in while working as a doorman at a nightclub in Australia. He didn't want to name the club, but said it was a nice place where he worked as the head doorman. One night, he turned away 2 men who were too drunk to enter, even though they claimed to be military personnel. Gary stayed polite and sent them away without any trouble. Later that night, after his shift, Gary went to a Greek restaurant for some food. While he was halfway through his steak, the 2 men, now dressed in full military gear, walked in and confronted him about his attitude towards soldiers. Things escalated fast when one of them punched Gary in the face while he was still sitting down. Gary didn't waste time. He flipped the table at the other guy and took down the one who punched him. But while they were grappling on the floor, the second guy used Gary's head like a football, causing some serious injuries. Realizing he was in real danger, Gary instinctively bit the guy's ear off. The fight kept going, with Gary taking more hits, like a closed eye from a kick and a head injury from being smacked with a stool. Despite the madness, Gary chased the other soldier across the restaurant. When the man tried to jump over a banister at the top of the stairs, he missed and fell straight out of the second-story window, right into the path of a passing cab, which hit and killed him. Gary was later accused of throwing him out of the window and had to leave Australia in a hurry after that. At 25, Gary decided to head to Tokyo, Japan, to keep studying martial arts. He enrolled at the Goju Ryu Dojo of Goen the Cat Yamaguchi, where he earned his 3rd and 4th degree black belts. While in Japan, he trained at several university dojos and earned the nickname Kuma-san, which means Mr. Bear. Gary also made friends with other foreign fighters training there, including Brian Fitkin, Steve Peake, John Robertson, Brian Waits, Ray Edler, and Steve Moyes. Later that year, Gary went to Okinawa to train at the Jundan Dojo of Ich Miyazato, learning Okinawan Goju Ryu. When he returned to Japan, he continued his training at the Yoyogi Dojo of Moro Hiyana in Tokyo, and even stayed at his teacher's home as a guest. Gary developed a huge respect for Moro Hiyana, saying he was one of the best fighters he'd ever faced. After wrapping up his training, Gary made his way to the UK, traveling through Russia and Europe on the way. When Gary first arrived in the UK, he started teaching his own style of combatives, which he called applied karate. For the first couple of years, he stayed with his good mate Terry O'Neill, who he had met in Japan. Terry invited Gary to the UK when he was ready to leave Japan. So, in 1971, Gary arrived in Liverpool and ended up staying there for the rest of his life. Gary met Terry O'Neill when Terry was part of the first British karate team in Japan, alongside Tiki Donovan and other well-known British martial artists. The two became close friends in the early 70s. In 1971, Gary opened the first Goju Ryu club in the UK and started his own association. This was before the martial arts craze kicked off after Bruce Lee and Enter the Dragon. Times were tough financially, so Gary worked as a doorman in addition to teaching. As he got more involved in the UK security scene, his tough reputation started to grow. When Gary returned to working the doors, the violence came with it. He became a security advisor for a big entertainment company in a seaside resort, working there for 2.5 years and facing some of the most dangerous situations of his career. The venue would attract thousands of people on weekends, including troublemakers. With only about 10 security staff, they often had to stop coachloads of drunk and aggressive people from getting in. Sometimes these troublemakers snuck in, and Gary and his team would have to remove them quickly before they caused any harm. One intense situation involved a doorman friend who was attacked with an axe to his back. Gary believed in dealing with situations immediately, feeling that legal penalties were too lenient. His approach usually stopped the violence on the spot. Gary was stabbed multiple times while working security, and anyone who tried using a weapon on him, especially a knife, which he really disliked, was met with maximum force. "The day I start feeling merciful to someone who's just tried to chop me up is the day I quit this job and join the church or something," Gary once said. And I'm not in the forgiveness business either. Gary wasn't the kind of doorman who just restrained someone. If you were there to hurt him or anyone else, he'd throw every martial arts move he knew at you. He even used a Ushiro Kubitsuki, a rear headbutt, on one guy, flattening his face like a pancake. In an interview with Fighting Arts magazine, Gary was asked if he was ever afraid of killing someone in a fight. He thought about it and said, "What can I do? I've never started an attack. The options are always there for those who start the trouble. Let's put it this way. I certainly don't want to kill anyone, but I'd rather be the one accused at someone's murder trial than be the one who ends up dead." One of Gary's most dangerous adversaries was a guy he called Mr. Farmer. Farmer had a fearsome reputation, known as the Terror of Toxie, and the national tabloids dubbed him a hard case. After his death, the tabloids made sure to highlight his reputation. Farmer was a massive guy, standing about 6 feet tall and weighing over 18 stone. He was a tough-as-nails heavyweight boxer who wasn't afraid to fight anyone. Most people didn't like him, but no one dared to mess with him because he had beaten so many, even in rematches. Farmer wasn't known for taking many breaks during his fighting career. He made a living off intimidating and beating people, usually while doing time in between prison stints. A couple of years before his death in a street fight, Gary Spiers had a major run-in with him. It all started when Farmer knocked a girl out cold on the dance floor of a club where Gary was working. The reason? She'd refused to dance with him. Some people don't need much of a reason to start trouble. By the time Gary got upstairs, both the girl and a small Indian doctor who'd tried to step in were lying on the floor. The doctor, who was barely 5 feet tall, was the only one brave enough to confront Farmer, and for his trouble, he got a punch that broke his glasses, his nose, and knocked out a few teeth. Gary didn't touch Farmer at first because he wasn't sure what had happened. He just told him, "You've got to leave, boss." But even though Gary had been warned about how fast Farmer was with his hands, he still got nailed with a perfect hook to the jaw. The punch shook him up and made him lose a fraction of time, but he didn't go down. Gary managed to take Farmer to the floor by ducking low, grabbing behind his knee and driving his shoulder into Farmer's groin. Once they were on the floor, Gary instinctively had Farmer in a half-strangle hold. He could have finished him off right then, but Gary knew that Farmer's crew, the Stanley Boys, were infamous for using Stanley knives. Realizing he could get sliced to pieces if he kept going, Gary reluctantly let Farmer up. Farmer then challenged Gary to a fight outside, just the two of them. Gary agreed, knowing the risks. He was aware that going outside could bring the police into the mix, and there was also the chance Farmer's gang would ambush him. Even with other bouncers on duty, the situation was unpredictable. Trusted colleagues might not have his back due to personal issues or fear of retaliation. Gary always kept these potential dangers in mind when dealing with confrontations. They went outside, and Farmer laid out the rules for the fight. No kicking. Gary knew the idea of rules in a real fight was pretty ridiculous, but he agreed, saying, "That'll do me. Let's go." They started, and as Gary charged, Farmer punched, causing Gary's right forearm to end up in Farmer's mouth. Farmer bit down hard, almost to the bone. The pain was intense, but Gary held his right fist with his left hand and began smashing Farmer's head against the wall behind him. The pain from the bite caused Farmer to choke on Gary's forearm. Instinctively, Gary kneed Farmer twice, once in the stomach, once in the hip, planning to go for the groin next. However, these knee strikes triggered savage threats from Farmer's gang, who had pulled out knives. Luckily, Gary's colleagues followed him outside, which probably stopped the gang from attacking. Gary kept on with a few elbows to Farmer's gut, but their locked positions made it tough to land any solid blows. He couldn't knock Farmer out though. He'd heard Farmer had been knocked out before, but he hadn't yet met anyone who'd actually done it. Farmer eventually became too exhausted to keep going, while Gary still had plenty of energy left. Gary fought the urge to finish him off with a fumikomi, a stomp kick, knowing that if he did, things would only escalate. He decided to let it go, but it was clear that Farmer was done for. Gary warned him that if he ever came back looking for a rematch, he would seriously consider crippling him permanently. Whether Farmer believed him or not, he never caused any trouble at a place where Gary was working again. Years later, Farmer went too far with someone, and it ended up costing him his life. The story Gary heard was that Farmer was doing what he did best, intimidating people. When someone finally had enough. With one swift move, they drove a carving knife under his arm and into his heart. That was the end of Mr. Farmer. Among all the wild Gary Spiers stories I've come across while researching this video, one of my personal favorites involves none other than the king of pop himself, Michael Jackson. Yes, you read that right. In 1988, during Michael Jackson's Bad World Tour, Gary was chosen for the security contract for the Liverpool concert at Aintree Racecourse. This was a huge testament to his exceptional reputation and the respect he had in the security industry. After the concert, Gary approached the promoters who had promised to pay him and his crew right away. When they said they would settle the payment in a few days, Gary made it very clear. If he didn't get paid immediately, Michael Jackson wouldn't be getting on the helicopter, waiting to take him away. It's no surprise that the promoters settled the payment right then and there. Not even MJ was safe from Gary's demands. In 1987, Gary earned his 5th Dan, Go-Dan, black belt, a major accomplishment awarded personally by Master Goen Yamaguchi, one of the most respected figures in Goju-Ryu karate. This honor marked the pinnacle of years of hard training and mastery in the art of karate. Sadly, Gary Spiers passed away on February 17, 2001, in the UK, after a 3-year battle with diabetes and pancreatitis. He was 57 years old. His body was returned to New Zealand for a traditional Maori burial, a ceremony that lasted 5 days. Gary Spiers was a true samurai, respected for his skills, feared by his enemies, and admired for his honor. His life was surrounded by myths and rumors, with people claiming he served in Vietnam, worked for the CIA, was a mercenary soldier, or even a triad enforcer. But none of that really mattered. The truth was impressive enough. For over 35 years, Gary was involved in professional violence, not as a fighter looking for trouble, but as someone dedicated to stopping violence in some of the most dangerous places. He became a legend in a business where impressing others was tough. Gary spent his life teaching people how to protect themselves, using violence to stop it when necessary. Once regarded as the deadliest street fighter alive, his legacy continues to inspire and influence the world of martial arts and self-defense.